Now let's convert these playback rates into a drop-down menu. The first thing I want to do is create a new component called drop-down menu, and we'll be moving these audio player files into their own component folder. So let's do new folder, audio player. We'll move these two in here. And before we do that, let's make sure that we adjust the paths. And in app.js, we want to make sure that we update to audio player. Make sure we have not broken anything. Refresh. All right, everything is still there. Now in this components folder, let's create a new folder called dropdown menu. And in that folder, we'll create a new file called dropdown menu.js. Now let's just create a function component. So const dropdown menu. And we're going to start with an options prop, but we'll be adding more later. And we'll make that an arrow function. And for now, we're just going to return some placeholder text of a div with the word dropdown menu. And now let's not forget to export default dropdown menu. Now I'm going to import dropdown menu from dropdown menu, dropdown menu. Now let's go back to the rates and let's comment this out since we'll be using it later. And then we will add dropdown menu, and in the options, we'll pass in the rates. And now we have that component in place. Before we start building this, I want to take a look at some of the APG examples. This is an example of how an accessible menu might look. Just note that this example demonstrates how the menu button design pattern can be used to create a button that opens an action menu. The thing that is really nice about these examples is they show you what it looks like. It tells you some accessibility features. And it also shows you what the keyboard support is. In this particular example, there is menu button support. So on the trigger of the menu, we have space, enter, down arrow, and that opens the menu and focuses on the first menu item. And then the up arrow, which opens the menu and focuses on the last menu item. And then on the menu itself, it has enter, which activates the menu item. So this is when you are actually in the menu. It activates the menu item, it closes the menu, and then sets the focus on the menu button. And you can see we have a few in here. We have escape, up arrow, down arrow, etc. Just one thing to note, this is an example. You can take a look at some of the APG menu and menu button patterns. If I'm in the menu pattern, you can see that there's some examples in here. And you can see that some of the things that were mentioned, like spacebar, is optional. And you can also see things like home, if the arrow key wrapping is not supported, meaning that if it's not circular, same thing with end. And also pressing a printable character is optional. So this would mean that if you press the P key, it would go to the first menu item that started with P. This is also optional, so we're not going to include that in this example. You can also look at the menu button, and you can see that the down arrow and up arrow are also optional, so we aren't going to do that in this example. So now that we have a good idea of what needs to happen, let's start doing some pseudocode in that drop-down menu file. The first thing we need is to create a state for open close menu. Need to be able to send focus to various places. We'll do A to button upon close, to other menu items upon arrow keys, and we navigate focus in menu through arrow keys, not tab. So instead of this div with drop-down menu text, we're going to make it actually function like a drop-down menu. So first, we are going to need a few things from React. We are going to import useState and useRef from React. And I'm going to create two refs. So const button toggle ref equals useRef, and we're going to set that to null. And then const dropdown wrapper ref equals useRef null. And now I'm going to create an isOpenState. And so we are going to destructure isOpen and set isOpen from useState. And the initial value will be false. Next, we're going to remove this drop-down menu text, and we are going to create a button, and that button is going to have the text of menu. And then we are going to add a ref to that button, and we're going to put that as the button toggle ref. We are also going to add an onClick handler on the button, and we are going to pass in a function called toggle menu, create that function. And for right now, we are going to just set is open to the opposite of is open. So remember, we only have an on click right here. We don't need to add an on key down because we're not supporting the arrow keys. But if we were, we would want to have an on key down. But on click on a button supports space and enter. Next, I'm going to create a div. That div, I'm going to add a ref and call it dropdown wrapper ref. Next, we're going to take what we just commented out of the audio player. Next, we are going to paste that inside of the div, and let's uncomment it. And instead of rates, we are going to change this to options. So change rate doesn't exist in this component. So for now, I'm going to change this to an anonymous function. And I'm also going to do the same thing for on key down and create it an anonymous function that does nothing. We'll handle that in a bit. One thing I also want to do on these buttons is add a tab index of -1. What this does is it takes this button out of the tab order, but we can still use JavaScript to focus on it. So it's focusable, but not in the tab order. So before I move on any further, let's get some styling in. You can do this in multiple different ways, but I'm just going to use CSS classes for the simplicity of it. So I'm going to add a button class, a menu class, and a class name. I've already created styling with certain class names, so I am going to add those classes into my React component. For this menu class, I'm going to make it a ternary. So if is open, I'm going to create a template literal and do menu class open. Otherwise, we'll just render menu class. Now that we've added all of those props, let's pass those props into the dropdown component. Now, to make things a little bit cleaner, I'm going to go back to the top of our file where the states are rendered and create a playback rate state. So const playback rate and set playback rate, and those will be structured from useState, and the initial state will be 1. We'll take the set playback rate function and go back to change rate, and we'll update the playback rate in that change rate function. Next, we want to make sure we pass the change rate into the dropdown component, but right now we don't have a prop for it, so let's go back to the dropdown menu. Let's go back up to the top, and we'll add a prop called on option click. Now back in the audio player, let's go ahead and pass that prop the change rate function. In the drop-down menu, on option click, and we'll pass it change rate. Now we want to make sure that we actually use that in the drop-down menu. So let's go back to the option. We're going to replace that with a function called handle option click. And we are going to pass that function the option. Just to make this a little bit more consistent, instead of using rate, we will change that to be option. Now let's create that function. So let's go up. Next, we'll write an arrow function. So const handle option click. We'll pass in that option as a parameter. And in that, we'll do on option click option. Now this is technically working, but it's kind of hard to tell because we have the button text still as menu and it's not dynamically updating when we change the playback rate. So this is technically working and changing the playback rate, but it's not updating the text. So let's create a new prop called button text for the drop-down menu. So button text as a new prop. Now back in the audio player, we will create a variable and store the button text in there. So I'm going to call that text button text. And we are going to just render some JSX. So I'll create a React fragment. Then I'll create a span with a class name of visually hidden. And in that visually hidden span, we'll call that playback rate. Then we'll do another span. And then we will do the playback rate state. And we'll put a little X there. Next, let's take that button text and pass it into that drop-down menu. Next thing we have to do is we have to go back to the drop-down menu and actually render the button text in that menu button. So let's remove this menu text. Next, when we refresh and we change the playback rate, you'll see it'll update, but now it doesn't close. So we have to fix that. So inside the handle option click, we will do set is open to false. So now when we open it and we select a rate, it will close. So that's all well and good, but if we tap through this, so we're pressing a tab key, tab, and we get to the drop down, we open it, it's still focused on the button. So we want to send the focus into the menu. So we want to use this toggle menu function to toggle the focus as well. So remember, we want to focus on the first item when we open the menu. So I'm going to create a variable called focus element. Before we toggle the is open state, we want it to focus on the button toggle ref. So that way, after we change the state, it'll focus on the button toggle ref. Otherwise, we want to do dropdown, wrapper, ref, current, and then we want to use query selector and button. This will get the first button inside that dropdown wrapper ref. Next, we want to request animation frame, wrap that in an anonymous function. And then we want to do focus element focus. The reason why we have to use request animation frame is if something doesn't exist in the DOM, for example, if it's display none, we want to wait until it appears before we send the focus. Otherwise, it's not going to do anything. So let's see how that works now. So I press the spacebar and it focuses on the first item. But now we can't navigate. So if I press the arrow keys, we can't navigate through these options. So let's quickly just return back to the documentation to see what we need to do. So if we go to this menu, we see that enter activates the menu item, and we already have this built in by using a button. Escape closes the menu and sets the focus back to the button. Up arrow moves focus from the previous item, but if it's on the first item, it'll move it to the last item. So it's kind of circular, and vice versa for down arrow. One last thing to note, which isn't documented here, if I'm pressing enter and I'm going through and I press the tab key, it'll close the menu and focus on the next item. So let's go back to the code and let's create a handle option key down. We're going to pass an event and an index. And now before we do anything, we're going to console log key. So this will help us filter out what keys we'll be looking for. Let's go ahead and pass this to all of those menu buttons. So instead of this anonymous function that returns nothing, we're going to do handle option key down. And inside of that anonymous function, we are going to pass the event. We're also going to pass the event to handle key down. And then we're also going to pass in the index. And let's go back to the console on the browser to check it out. So let's refresh, open the console. We'll tab. I'll press the spacebar. And then I'll press the down key. So arrow down, up key, arrow up, tab key, and then escape. So now we have all of these strings that we can use. So back in the drop-down menu, we can use this event key and add it to a switch statement. So switch key. And then we are going to create a bunch of cases. To make this a little bit easier, I'm going to create a bunch of constants. So top, I'm going to create const tab key equals tab, const down key equals arrow down, const up key equals arrow up, and const escape key equals escape. So now let's create a bunch of cases using those constants. So case tab key, and then we're going to make sure we put a break in all of them. Case up key, break, case down key, break, case escape key, break, and then default. So let's start with the tab key because that's the easiest. We're going to keep the tab key to be the same behavior. If you remember when we pressed the tab key when we were already there, it just tabbed out. All we have to do now is set is open to false. The next easiest one is the escape key. So we're going to set is open to false. And we are also going to do button toggle ref current focus. Let's see how that works. Tab, space. And if I press tab again, it does what it needs to do. Now let's try the escape key. So enter escape, and it focuses back on the menu button. Let's go back to that function, and outside of the switch statement, let's create a variable called const options node list. And we're going to use that drop down wrapper ref current. And this time we're going to do a query selector all, and we are going to target that button. So let's start with the down key first. So in theory, we could just use that index. So do options, node, list, and use the index plus 1 and focus. So what we're doing is we're getting that option plus 1 in the node list based off of the current index. We press save and go back to our audio player and refresh. Tab, 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 space. It works up. Not anymore, because now we don't have an I plus 1. The options list has run out. So what we need to do is create an if else. So if I equals options node list length minus 1, and then I will do an else and wrap what we just did. So what we want to do if we are on the last item of that node list is we want to focus on the first one. So we'll do options node list 0 focus. So now let's see how that works. So now let's tab, 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 spacebar, and we are using the down key. So down, 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 and we're going in a circular motion. Now we just want to do the opposite for the up key. So let's do an if else again, if else, and then in the if condition, we are going to do I equals 0. Let's start with the else since it's a little easier. So we'll do options node list I minus 1 focus. Otherwise, we are going to do options node list. We'll do options node list length minus 1 focus. Now let's try that out. So tab, 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 space. And now we can do it the other way. Before we continue on, I want to go back to the actions. If we scroll down to the bottom and go to the role, property, state, and tabindex attributes, you'll see that we have a bunch of aria attributes that we. So aria popup true indicates that the button opens a menu. Aria controls refers to the menu element controlled by the menu button. Aria-expanded is added when the menu is open. And then on the menu itself, see that they have the role on the wrapper identifies it as a menu. We have an aria labeled by, which menu. We have a role of menu item, which identifies items. And then those items tab in. Let's use that information we just learned and add it to our markup. First, on the div that has the drop-down wrapper ref, we'll add a role. On the options, we'll add a role equals menu item. We've already added the tab index. Now let's add an aria has popup equals true. Then we'll add an aria-expanded equals, and we'll make this a ternary. So if it is open, it'll be true. Otherwise, it'll be undefined. We still have to add an aria controls to the button, but what's that going to be? For now, we will make that say ID, but ideally, we might have more than one drop-down menu on the page. And we need to make sure that this ID that it will map to is unique. I'm going to use a library called unique ID. Once we've added this, we can create our own unique ID. So at the top of the file, I'll import unique ID from unique ID. Then I'll create two unique IDs. So menu button ID equals unique ID, and we'll start it with menu dash. Then I'll create const dropdown ID equals unique ID drop down dash. Now what we'll do is we'll add these IDs onto their respective elements. So we'll go back to the menu button. We'll add an ID to the button, give it menu button ID, and then on the menu itself, we'll add an ID drop down ID. In order to give the aria controls its own appropriate value, we have to match it to the ID of the dropdown. So dropdown ID. What this does is it says that this element controls the element with this ID. Last, on the menu, we'll add an aria labeled by, and then we will match it to the menu button ID.